So we are in Luke chapter number 12 this morning, and we are in week 3 of a series in the book of Luke that we've called Encounters. And so in week 1, Werner spoke to us about the golden rule, and that's how we should treat one another. In other words, treat one another as we want to be treated. Last week, Ethan looked at the parable of the Good Samaritan and how we are all called to make a difference in the spaces where we find ourselves in. Those sermons are available on YouTube and on our podcast platforms. And so, as I said earlier, we are in Luke 12 this morning, and we are going to witness another encounter that Jesus has. And so at the beginning of the chapter, Jesus is preaching to thousands and thousands of people. He's delivering a sermon, but he's delivering the sermon directly to his disciples, and the crowds of thousands are listening in. They're leaning in. So Jesus has a direct audience, but indirectly he is talking to many more people who he hoped would grab the crumbs of his discourse. As we would know, both the book of Luke and Acts are written to Theophilus. That word or that name, Theophilus, means friend of God. So every time we read the book of Luke, we must be reminded that all of us, as friends of God, are invited in to hear what our Master has to say. So even as we look at Luke 12, Jesus is not just talking to these people, he's also speaking to us. So this is how I want us to look at this text. We'll walk through the text, and then at the end we'll make some observations. Luke 12 starts, and Jesus is talking to the people about the false piety of the Pharisees. And he's saying that these guys, if you follow them, they will lead you nowhere. But right in the middle of his sermon or his discourse, somebody from the crowd shouts the following: "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." So in the middle of a hot sermon, one of you just decides to, this is what happened to Jesus. From the outburst from the crowd, we can surmise or pick up a few things. The man who spoke was probably a younger brother to somebody else. And somebody would say, duh, how do we know this? Well, at the time, the custom was if a father was about to die, as he was preparing for his death, he would take his inheritance and divide it amongst his children. In this case, we presume that this father had 2 sons. So the father would take his inheritance, all that he had, the wealth and the possessions, and he would divide them into 3, right? And then he would give the younger son 1/3 of the inheritance, and the older son 2/3 of the inheritance. Those of you who are charismatic would know the double portion, eh? Not as double as you think, does it? Because that's where it comes from. Interestingly, Jesus in Luke 15 uses the story of 2 brothers fighting about an inheritance. It probably came from here. And so in our case, we would assume that the father had probably died, and the older brother was now stalling. He was delaying dividing up the assets between himself and his younger brother. And clearly this would have annoyed the younger brother because he wanted his money, and he wanted his money now. You know what they say? Show me the money. And so, as Jesus is preaching, he's like, nah, man. This guy is a guy we're all listening to. Let me shout and tell him to tell you to do what you're supposed to do. We would debate this, but I think it's probably true that the older brother was there as well. Because it says, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. But how Jesus responds is very strange. In verse 14, he says, "Friend, who appointed me a judge or arbitrator over you?" Jesus' answer is strange because at that time, rabbis were known to intervene or interfere in the affairs of people. Especially if you're a rabbi who's trying to make a name for yourself. If people brought a problem to you, you'd want people to walk away saying the following about you. Hey, did you hear Rabbi Yeshua? Did you hear what he told the Kumalo boys? That's a man worth following. But Jesus was not interested in making a name for himself. So instead of giving the man the answer that he wanted, he answers his question with a question. In other words, he was saying to him, young man, I am not interested in the question that you're asking me. I actually want to go a bit deeper with you. How do we know this? Just before he tells him that he's not going to answer his question, he calls him friend. Friend. I'm not just going to treat you like some guy in the street. I want you to come a bit closer to where you will learn and grow. And so he says to him in verse 15, watch out and be on guard against all greed, because one's life is not in the abundance of his possessions. One's life is not in the abundance of his possessions. Jesus' words, when he says, watch out and be on guard against all greed, are spoken in the present continuous tense. The present continuous tense. In other words, he is saying, always be vigilant on or against greed. Always be vigilant. If you catch greed today, don't worry, it will come back tomorrow. So always be vigilant. So with that statement, Jesus moves away from the request made of him. And he talks about something that seems to us so unrelated to the request. But what Jesus is going after is at the heart of the question. He's gone to the root of the problem. Here's the thing about Jesus. His answers never gratify our flesh. But they always call us to something a bit higher. It's not to satisfy what we want him to satisfy. It's calling you to something else. Because deep down inside, Jesus is saying, you as the younger brother just want more in your life. What you really want is more than what you already have. And so Jesus is speaking about the human desire of always wanting more than what we need. Because we all believe that the more we have, the better we'll be, right? If I just had more money, if I just had more house, my life would be better. Because if we were to be honest, our reaction to people who have better cars, better salaries, and bigger homes than us is always respect. They have life sorted out. They've made it in life. And then we live in a city like Joburg that encourages us. It pushes us to want more, as if moreness is the ultimate aim of life. So Jesus wants to teach this man a lesson. So he says, let's expound on that. So he tells a parable, not a terrible. To us it would be terrible to hear this parable. And a parable was a great teaching tool. So in verse 16 he says, then he told them, Jesus telling them, the crowds, a rich man's land was very productive. He thought to himself, what should I do? What should I do since I don't have anywhere to store my crops? The harvest was so great that it exceeded all the storage spaces that he had. Verse 18. I will do this, he said. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones and store all my grain and my goods there. 19. Then I'll say to myself, you have many goods stored up for many years. Take it easy, eat, drink, and enjoy yourself. Jesus obviously uses an illustration that makes sense to his audience. For those of us who live 2,000 years later, those of us who are not in a farming economy, this doesn't quite make sense, right? After all, some of you think that the veggies grow in the aisles of Woolies, right? Oh, sorry, I meant your kids. Your kids think that, not you. So let me bring it to where we are. Think of a businessman who had a startup company, and he made some solution or an app, and he sold that software solution for 5 billion rand. He never thought he'd see so much money in his life, and now he's hit the jackpot. So that night, as he contemplates the 5 billion rand offer, he sits at his desk and he begins to imagine, what am I going to do with all this money that's coming my way? So he says, I'll set up a few companies that will give me more revenue streams. I've always wanted a fleet of sports cars. So, tomorrow, I'm no longer dreaming, I'm ordering. He's wanted to travel the world and go to different places. So tomorrow, he knows of that guy on YouTube who's always selling planes. I'm going to give him a call and buy me myself a Gulfstream 650. Because I have a government that wants to tax me, I must buy a house in Dubai and one in Mauritius where I will not be taxed. Life is good. By all accounts, we would say, and Jesus says this in the text, this guy is somebody who's being rewarded for his hard work, right? We expect that when we work hard, things like this would happen to us. And so we can sum up this man's life in one sentence. It says, got me some money, so I'm going to put it away, be at leisure, and withdraw from life. Truth be told, many of us in this room work hard daily, hoping that the day we retire, we will get to do exactly this. That we would have accumulated enough money to sit, relax, perhaps travel, but just enjoy life, right? I work hard waiting for that day. How many of you have watched the TV show I Blew It? We would all agree that those people were never rich, right? Most of them. But what happens when the money comes in? All of them desire what? The soft life. They want to be at ease, enjoy. And that's the aim of most human beings. So given an opportunity, all of us would behave exactly like this man. So as he was talking to himself, telling himself what he would do with the riches that he had obtained, God was also listening in on the conversation. And it says in verse 20, God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life is demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be?" Now watch this. These guys, and probably even today, lived in a culture where when you were wealthy, it was a sign of God's blessing on your life. If you were wealthy, it showed that you were following the dictates of God. So when Jesus says this, I'm sure the crowd was like, hey, but isn't God blessing this man? Everyone expected Jesus to say, well done, good and faithful servant, now enjoy life and chill. But Jesus doesn't say that. God calls him a fool. And he declares it this night, not tomorrow, not next week, this night, your life will end. If you would recall in our series in Proverbs last year, we spoke about the fool. And we said the fool is the one who doesn't follow the dictates and the instructions of God. Therefore, this man, because he's been called a fool, clearly he didn't have God's purposes in mind. I love how Proverbs 1:32 is put in the easy-to-read version. It says, fools die because they refuse to follow wisdom. They are content to follow their foolish ways, and that will destroy them. God says this very night, your life will be called up. And so in verse 21, Jesus says, that's how it is with the one who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Plainly put, if you are a hoarder of wealth and not generous towards God, you are a fool. And you will suffer the consequences of your foolishness. But then that begs the question, how do you become rich towards God? How do you become rich towards God? Is being rich towards God taking all that you have and kind of throwing it up in the sky? Hey, God, here's my wealth, here are my possessions. Some of us would think that, right? No, being rich towards God is being generous towards other people. As John says, how can you say you love God whom you've not seen, yet hate the people that you do see? I'm sure as Jesus was talking to the crowd about how this man's life was going to be called, because he was not generous toward God, they thought, yeah, Jesus, yes. Tell the rich people, tell those people to be generous with everything that they have. Jesus, tell them. They must be generous, especially toward me. Because here's the thing. As Jesus is telling the story, we fall into the temptation of thinking that he's not talking to us. He's always talking to somebody who has more than us. But if we go back to who asked the question, we know that Jesus was talking to the younger brother, not the older brother who we assume had everything. He was talking to the one who did not have much. You see, child of God, we need to realize something about this warning that Jesus gives about greed. Jesus says his warning about greed is not limited to the Smiths with their Bentleys. It's not limited to the Joneses and Kumalos with their Beamers and Benzes. No, his warning on greed also extends to Leslie and Lesego who drive their Polos and Toyotas. But he doesn't stop there. His word, his warning on greed, reaches to Susie in her Uber and even Mandisa in the taxi. Yes, where Fofo Mahlalisane happens. Jesus' warning applies to all of us. And his warning on greed is countercultural because it doesn't just target one group of people and leaving the rest. God says, my standards are for all of y'all. What I expect of one, I expect from all my children. And Jesus knew that once he talks to people on an even level, treating the rich the same as the poor, some people in the crowd would begin to murmur. Something would come up in their hearts. And we see this in verse 22. Then he said to his disciples, therefore I tell you, don't worry about your life, what you will eat, or about the body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. You see, once you say to people, give of what you have, they start to be anxious, troubled, and they worry if they'll have enough left over for themselves. Because Jesus, if you're asking me to give, what happens if I don't have anything left? Here's the truth. Worry affects all of us. Because we worry about our future. We worry about our security. We worry about our children. We worry about all manner of things. As I read this text, I find something quite ironic in it. Because the very thing that the businessman was hoarding, possessions, is exactly what we worry about. You see, greed accumulates and stores the stuff up. Worry stays up day and night thinking of how I can keep the stuff. So I accumulate only to worry whether it will stay with me. And this leads us to our first observation. Here's the first observation. Greed and worry are two sides of the same coin. Greed and worry are two sides of the same coin. You see, greed and worry focus on self. They both focus on me. Let's go back to verse 17. And we see two kinds of fools in this passage. And the first one we'll look at is the narcissistic fool. This guy says, he thought to himself, what should I do since I don't have anywhere to store my crops? The harvest was so great that it exceeded all the storage spaces that he had. And then in verse 18 he says, I will do this. I'll tear down my barns. Jump to verse 19. Then I'll say to myself, you have many goods stored up for many years. Take it easy, drink, and enjoy self. In 3 verses, this guy uses the word I and my several times. So clearly everything was about him. It was about his wealth and what he would do with his wealth. For a guy to tear down his barns, not to call other people and say, hey guys, please help me. No. I am going to tear down my barns and build bigger ones, says that he was all about increasing himself. I want to be the biggest guy in the region. This is the kind of person who reads Ecclesiastes 10 and 19, which says, and money is the answer for everything. So he says, the more I have, I will answer all the problems of life. So he read that and said, I will do this for me. But then he forgot to go to the next chapter, in chapter 11. Where Solomon says, oh, by the way, when you have all that money, when you have everything, acknowledge God and be generous. You see, greed makes us all believe that life is about accumulation. I'm here on this earth to get. And when I have everything, I will be happy. My happiness is guaranteed. Because the money I have will get me power, and that will guarantee me a better tomorrow. Everything will be within my control. For those of you who've spoken to people with lots of money, you know how they talk, right? They talk like nothing, no one will get in their way. James, writing in James 4 and 13, says the following: pay attention, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a town. We will stay there a year, buying and selling and making a profit. Then he says in verse 14, you don't really know about tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for only a short while before it vanishes. Here's what you ought to say: if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. You see, not everything is within your control. No matter how much money you have, not everything is in your control. But this man didn't understand that. He was so prideful that God could only respond in one way and say to him, you fool. And God's response is a proverbial case of this: you can never take it with you. It doesn't matter how much money you have. When you die, it stays here. Ask the pharaohs in Egypt. They were buried with their wealth. And guess what? Thieves came and stole it. Ask the billionaire who left a fortune for his family, and his kids and his grandkids and his great-grandkids fight over the money. Gone. You can't take it with you. But before we come to a conclusion, let's look at the next fool that we see in this passage. The narrow-minded fool. Verse 22. Then he said to his disciples, therefore I tell you, don't worry about your life, what you will eat, or about the body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. The second fool is not about boasting or bragging about what they have, but they are a fool because of their attitude towards God. Their attitude towards God makes God small. You see, when you and I are anxious about what we're going to eat, what we're going to wear, we are basically saying the only way to get out of our predicament is to accumulate stuff. God, we are so poor that we want to do what everyone else is doing so we can have more and not be poor. When we worry, we don't give God an opportunity to work in and through our lives. And so in a city like ours, we jump into the rat race like everyone else, trying to make ends meet. And then we spend the night tossing and turning in our beds because we don't actually make enough, even though we're slaving away. Funny thing is that even wealthy people worry. Though they have a lot in our eyes, somehow they worry whether it is still enough. One guy who interviews the guys who are on the Forbes richest list asked one billionaire, he says, what do you worry about? The guy said, well, I thought when I became a billionaire, I would not worry anymore. But now that I am a billionaire, I worry whether I will need 10 more billion to be better than other people. Dumb to us, but the human heart is never satisfied. Jesus says worrying doesn't add a day to our lives. Instead, when we worry, we get frown lines, we get gray hair, we become overweight and generally unhealthy. Here's the thing about both greedy people and people who worry. We are both focused on providing for ourselves, and we think that when we provide for ourselves, we will find happiness in that. People who are anxious think too little about God, but even our thinking is dulled on how God thinks of us. We think God is small, and we think God doesn't care for us. And so Jesus gives them a picture to help them understand what God's attitude is toward us. In verse 25 of our text, he says, "Consider the ravens. They don't sow or reap. They don't have a storehouse or a barn." Watch this. He's contrasting the guy who had barns that he tore down, but these don't have that. Yet God feeds them. Aren't you worth much more than the birds? Can any of you add 1 moment to his lifespan by worrying? If then you're not able to do even a little thing, why worry about the rest? Verse 27. "Consider how the wildflowers grow. They don't labor or spin thread. Yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all his splendor was adorned like one of these." If that's how God clothes the grass, which is in the field today and is thrown into the furnace tomorrow, how much more will he do for you, you of little faith? Being summertime, we don't have to go far to see the birds out in the trees. We don't have to go far to see the flowers blooming. And Jesus says they're all looked after by God. They don't sweat. They don't hustle to make life work for themselves. No. But Jesus says that they are looked after. But not only that, you are more important than them. You are more important than them. And so Jesus kind of pushes his illustration a bit further, and he contrasts the flowers in the field to the richest man that any Jewish person would know, King Solomon. The man who was so wealthy, he could dress himself in any way he so desired. Jesus says, Solomon in all get that? Jews in the crowd would be saying, Jesus, are you saying the guy that we all talk about, that guy, was not as beautiful as a simple flower that is here today and dead tomorrow? Jesus says, yes. God thinks you're more important than those flowers. I wish all of us could bottle that in and just run with it. God, you care more for me than the flowers? In a funny way, in a very hilarious way, I see this at play every December. Those of you who have housekeepers know what I'm talking about, or nannies. Those of you who own businesses would know that in a few weeks' time, some of your employees are going to leave you. Why? It's December, boss. We want a holiday just to relax. But because they are employed, they can't just take holiday when they want to. Right? And this is what they will do. They will resign or quit. Or Friday the 16th is the last time you'll see them. And when you say to somebody, but in this economy, when jobs are so hard to find, why are you quitting a job that you need? What are you going to do next year? Because January is worry month. You know what they say to you? Those guys, as foolish as their decisions are, really believe in a God who provides. I'm going to rest now. God will take care of the rest. That's what they do. Jesus is saying to us that if God did not withhold Christ, who came down to pay the biggest debt, the debt of sin that we could never pay, to absolve you from God's justice. If God could give Christ, what more about caring for your physical needs? God loves you, and He cares about your everyday situation. Perhaps you're one of those people who's fallen for a theology that says God only cares about your salvation. Only prosperity preachers preach about God looking after you. That's a lie from the pit of hell. Because right here in the text, Jesus is saying to them, God cares about your everyday needs. What you will wear, what you will eat, and where you will live. That's why He says in verse 28, how much more will He do for you, you of little faith? In other words, you and I need to have faith that God not only saves us, but we can rely on Him to take care of us daily. If you have faith that God can save you, why don't you believe that God cares for you and He can provide you with the things that you need? And so Jesus is pushing the crowd to trust God, that God is able to displace the worry in your heart by providing for you. And this is not a prosperity message. It's the gospel. It's the gospel of Jesus Christ. All God's children need to know this and live worry-free because we trust and have faith in Jesus. He says in the following verses, don't strive for what you should eat and what you should drink, and don't be anxious. For the Gentile world eagerly seeks all these things, and your Father knows that you need them. Jesus is saying to us that when we don't worry about these things, our focus on life will be different from the world around us. So we don't go to work hard to secure tomorrow because we're worried about it. We don't work hard so we can get more stuff and hoard things. No. We work hard because God has given us gifts and it's a blessing for them to be on display for the world. This is a very different mindset. In this text, Jesus calls both the greedy person and the warrior to move away from working hard because you're worried, to move away from working hard because you just want to accumulate. As His children, we're called to live differently. Now, I know that when the pastor preaches a sermon, people walk away with different ideas in their heads, not what the pastor necessarily meant. Some of you will walk away thinking, I no longer have to be responsible for my future. God cares. God knows it all. Let me just go live life. Some of you will walk away feeling guilty because, you are about to buy that nice car next week. Now the pastor will see it and, generous. Friends, this passage is not calling us to deny ourselves of nice things. It's not calling us to deny ourselves of nice cars or houses or those Jordans that are too expensive, but that's fine. It's also not calling us to not save. It's not calling us just to live a laissez-faire life where we don't invest and grow our money. Because if you have kids, you brought them here, please look after them. Don't make them a burden for us, look after them. So then the question arises, how then do we live for Christ in a culture of greed and worry? How do we live in a culture that is full of greed and worry? My second observation, then I'll be out of your way. Verse 21, Jesus said, this is how it is with the one who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. But seek first His kingdom. In verse 31 He says, and these things will be provided for you. Don't be afraid, little flock, because your Father delights to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Make money bags for yourselves that won't grow old, an inexhaustible treasure in heaven where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Jesus says, here's the panacea to this issue: have a kingdom mindset. A kingdom mindset doesn't find satisfaction in money and possessions. As I said a little while ago, we all like nice things. Let's not deny, we all like nice things. Whether it's a pair of shoes, an exclusive watch, the latest gadgets, or a car, we all like nice things. And there's nothing wrong with having nice things. The issue is that when we get those things, we think that they make us. Because I have such and such. God doesn't want us to find intrinsic value in our possessions. God doesn't want us to find contentment in our possessions. Yes, we should save and invest, but let's not think that having money put away will secure us against the issues of life. Because the truth is, people who find satisfactions in things quickly realize that they need more and more of those things to be satisfied more and more. Right? Secondly, a kingdom mindset doesn't find companionship in worry and anxiety. A kingdom minded person does not worry, not because we don't have needs. We have needs. That genuine needs of clothing and housing and whatnot. But God calls us to embrace the Father heart of Himself by faith. Trust that He's a good Father who sees and meets our needs. And when you trust that God sees and meets your need, you are taken out of the endless cycle of worry. You don't stay up at night not sleeping because you're worried. Because you know that just as He cares about the grass and the flowers, He cares for me too. The challenge is to live that out confidently every day. So those are the don'ts. This is what we don't do. So what do we do? We touched on this earlier, and we said we need to open up our hearts to being generous. And I love God because when He talks about generosity, He doesn't exclude anyone. God doesn't say, oh, you're too poor to be generous. No. God includes everybody. Whether you have a lot or you have a little, God calls all of us to generosity. God wants us to steer our money and our possessions towards kingdom matters. And God's kingdom is all about people. When we read the book of Acts and we saw this is what was happening. People opened up their bank accounts, their homes, their wealth, such that there was no need among the people of God. That is radical generosity. And God wants us to live like that. Because when we live with a kingdom mindset, we're declaring that money and possessions are merely a tool that God has given us to use. And we get the awesome privilege to steward it. And in 1 Timothy 6, Paul says, yes, we get to enjoy some of it, even as we are stewards of blessing to other people. A question that I love asking Christians is this: do you believe in heaven? Do you believe in the afterlife? If the answer is yes, why do you accumulate so much stuff? Why? You know you're going to leave it. Either Jesus comes back or you die. One of the two, you're going to leave it. So why do you live like the world in finding happiness and contentment in stuff when you know that my home is with Jesus, where I will be forever and a day? If we really believe in heaven, we can't cling on to wealth and possessions like the world does. That's why Jesus says, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Question for you this morning is, does your heart beat for the things of God? Are you a person who is listening and waiting on God's direction on what you should do with your possessions? 4 things you can do this week to check your heart and just see if this happens. Number 1, practice generosity. Go around the city, find somebody who's in need, bless them. It's not hard to do it here in Joburg. Ask God to give you a heart of joy. Maybe take it a bit further. Maybe this week as you step into Monday, take each day as a generosity challenge. God, how many people can I bless this week? How many people can I be a blessing to? I don't expect anything in return. I just want to open up my hand to be a blessing. Number 2, this is going to be a bit hard because I struggle with this as well. Limit and reflect on your purchases. Amen. So this week, as you're about to buy something, pause and think to yourself, do I really need this? Or is it just a want? Pray and ask God, God, hey, give me contentment. Trust me, as hard as it is, I think if you do it the first time, the second time, the third time, it starts becoming easier and easier, né? So limit your purchases and reflect on what God has already given you. Thank Him for that. Thank Him for that. I'll throw this out there and my wife will get on my case afterwards. For those of us who are coffee addicts, can I just give us a challenge? This week, let's not buy coffee. Let's thank God for the coffee we have at home. Let's thank God for the coffee that we have at home. Make it and take that to work, and let's use that coffee money to be a blessing, né? And the pastor fails it on Monday. That's just a challenge. Let's come back next Sunday and see if we did it. Number 3, make time for prayer and reconnection. I think if you take the week just to spend time just thanking God and just looking back at what God has brought you through, the bills that He has paid, the home that He has provided. Some of you went to varsity because somebody else was paying for you. That's worth thanking God for. God, thank you for your kindness and your goodness. I wouldn't be where I am without you. And as we pray about some things, God might radically move us to radical generosity. In other words, God might say, as you're praying as a couple, hey, give that car away. What? Yeah, give it away. But God, we're going to sell it. No, give it away. Because that's what happens when we come to God. We start praying radical prayers, and God requires us to do some dangerous things. And number 4, plan with generosity in mind. Maybe we need to review our budgets and see, God, is there room in our budgets for us to be more generous? Is there room in our budgets where we can remove some wants and some things that are frivolous in order to be a blessing? We want to prioritize your kingdom. And as I close, I want to remind us that Jesus' encounter with a younger brother is ultimately an encounter with us. This is not just written for us to read, it's written so that it can pierce our hearts. Jesus cautions us against being greedy. He cautions us against being full of worry. He says, guys, I want you to lift your eyes up to God. I want you to lift your eyes to where your reward will be and where your hearts need to be in the here and the now. The wonderful thing about Jesus is that even as He teaches this, God Himself, emptied Himself. Paul says He became poor to come here on earth to pay a debt that He never owed, but which was owed by us. And He paid the debt of sin such that we would never have to pay it. He redeemed us to be the children of God so we can live a life that is totally and completely satisfied in Him and not in created things. Jesus gave His life so that you and I can live in the abundance of His presence. And so He says, in light of everything that I have done for you, trust me more than money. Trust me more than anything else. Trust me.